So we're going to start this build off with some 1/4 walnut. You by no means need 1/4 walnut to pull this off. You can just use 2 regular boards. I've just had a fascination with resawing lumber, and this is the first opportunity that I got to do it. When you resaw the lumber, it just gives you a nice seamless glue up, and that's what I'm going for here. When cutting lumber, there's just a lot of energy built up inside, so when you cut it in half, it just kind of releases it, causing it to bow and go all weird, and this one had more bow than I'd like. So I sprayed a little water on it, clamped it in the opposite direction overnight, and I think it helped a little bit. Also, gluing it together will hold it flat even more, and we're cutting it into smaller pieces, so I'm not really worried about it. If this was a table or something along those lines where it wouldn't be chopped up, I'd be a little more concerned. But in this application, it doesn't really matter. So now we're just gonna run it through the drum sander to save some time sanding later on, and then we're just gonna hit it with an orbital sander and clean it up a little more. So now we're gonna reference the diagram to your left. We are cutting the dado for the back of the piece. I'm gonna cut this before so I don't gotta deal with it later. It's just to accept the back panel, and it just really closes off the piece. So I'm gonna go for continual grain. I spent that time resawing these boards, so I just really want that grain to look good, and we're gonna wrap it around the entire piece, so I'm marking out all these cuts now. I'm just gonna use a track saw to break these down to their exact size, and then we're gonna go over to the table saw and make our final cuts. So it's super crucial that we keep all of our cuts super organized right here. So I'm just gonna roll my workbench behind the table saw, mark everything out so that I don't get any of my cuts mixed up. So we're gonna set the degree here, and this degree is gonna stay exactly the same the entire time. We're just gonna cut some of the pieces regular and then cut some of the pieces vertical. Again, keep everything as organized as possible so you don't mess up your cuts, especially if you're doing continual grain. Jump into a diagram to show you what I mean. So these bottom cuts will be cut regular, and then the top cuts will be cut with the jig. Since our pieces were already cut to size with the track saw, I'm just gonna sneak up on this edge and get it as close as possible without removing any actual material. And then I'm gonna do the same thing here with this vertical jig. And since the top portion of the box was so steep, we have to cut these cuts vertical. Again, it's the same degree, but we're just simply using the jig to achieve that angle. There's a lot of ways to glue together a box. Typically, I would just use my Festool domino, but since it was such a tight angle, I was worried about them blowing through, so I just went with the tape method. This was my first time trying it, and it actually worked really well. I've been doing more and more box glue ups like this, and I had a lot of people recommend these ratchet strap clamps, and wow, they are great. Regular clamps are just fine, but these just help disperse the pressure evenly, keeping it square. And while that dries, we're just gonna move on to the shelf and get this glued together. Always gluing everything together a little big and cutting it to size later. When gluing together boxes, this has to be one of my favorite tips. You just put a little bit of tape on each edge, let it harden up for about 30-40 minutes, peel it off, scrape out any of the excess, and it saves you a ton of time in sanding. I took that offcut from that 1/4 piece of walnut, I resawed that, and that made up our drawer front. So now we're gonna move on to the base. If you buy plans from us, I will have all the degrees and measurements all laid out in nice diagrams. Since the plans weren't made yet, I'm just gonna reference my SketchUp and just draw it onto a piece of wood, and then duplicate that 4 times. And now I'm just gonna use an assortment of table saw jigs to cut out all my pieces. There's a lot of different ways to do this. You could even use a bandsaw. It would just require a little more sanding. And I actually cut pretty much all these pieces with scraps. Because they were relatively small, they were pretty easy to find scraps that would work for them. So I'm going to use the domino to assemble this just because it's quick and easy. You definitely don't need a domino. You can just use dowels. Instead of using one domino per joint, I would just use 2 dowels. Then I just let these sit overnight and then moved on to the next step. Now this step is definitely not needed. I just wanted to add a little flair, so I pinned each domino with 1/8" brass dowels, and it gave it a nice cool look. I got a pack of these on Amazon, and I think it was like $10 for a pack. And then we're just going to use epoxy to hold these things in place, and then just beat them in with a regular hammer, and then once they dry, we'll file them down with a regular file, and then sand them smooth. So let's get this base glue together. What you don't see is I never cut my runners to length, so the base was actually 2 inches longer than it should have been. I just had a bonehead moment, didn't think it through. I should have recorded it, I didn't think of it. I just simply cut the runners off, cut the piece to size, and then glued it back together. So a little misstep, but it happens. Since the body is tapered, we need to add these pieces here. Just these shims will counteract the angle of the body, allowing us to attach drawer slides at a 90-degree angle. Once you are sure they're square, just add a tiny bit of glue, and then I just did 3 1-inch brad nails. Now to add our shelf. We gotta cut this angle to match the body angle, and then we're just gonna nibble away at this thing until it fits in there. You'd be surprised how much of a little cut will actually move it lower. Since the piece is tapered, the shelf kind of wedges itself in there, and it would probably be fine with just a little bit of glue, but better safe than sorry. I just added 4 Craig screws, 1 in each corner, and that'll lock it in place forever. And this will never be seen once the drawer is installed. Since we added the Craig screws, you probably could have just skipped the glue completely, but I just added a little bit. It was even a little much. I was trying to avoid squeeze out, but I still got some. Just sink those babies home and hope you don't blow through the other side. Probably skip this step as well, since this will never be seen once the drawer's in, but I guess it's just the OCD in me. And then everyone should own one of these flush trim saws. Link down in the description if you're interested in one. They just work great for all kinds of stuff, especially stuff like this, trying to cut them flush. And then I just used the glue and sawdust trick to fill in any small gaps. Again, this is probably not needed, but it made me feel better. And since we pinned the dominoes with the brass pins, I figured, hey, let's add some hand-cut brass splines. And this is by no means necessary, I just thought it would look cool, so I went for it. And while you listen to the sweet sounds of me cutting through this walnut, a quick message from our sponsor of today's video. Sweezan makes a bunch of wonderful handsaws. We have 4 or 5 different models, and whether you're new to woodworking or experienced, every woodworker should have a couple handsaws on hand. So head on over to Amazon, check these out, I highly recommend them, and thanks Sweezan for sponsoring this video. So I'm not gonna lie, this was pretty intimidating. I spent all this time building this thing, and then I just started hacking into it with some handsaws. But overall it went pretty good. You don't need to do this, the glue is plenty strong enough on its own, but if you want to add a nice flair, I definitely recommend doing it. Or you could just do it with regular wood. I think maple would look cool as well. Personally, I'm always just kind of up for a challenge, and this seemed like a great challenge. So maybe in the next video I could maybe hand cut some dovetails. This chisel was actually too wide, so I actually had to grind down this chisel to get it to be the same exact thickness as the brass splines, but in the end it worked. I think it was like $6 on Amazon. I just used this Dremel and this little cutoff wheel. It took a lot longer than it should have, but I was too lazy to go get an angle grinder and a cutoff wheel, so that's what I used. And then I just filed down any burrs with the file, and then used the same exact epoxy as before to glue them in. I used the rubber mallet to get them in most of the way, but it just didn't have the oomph to kind of seat them in place. So I used a regular hammer to kind of give them that extra hit. So now to cut the brass splines flush. Jess said this seemed a little sketchy, but in reality, brass is pretty soft, so I wasn't really too worried about it. This is just a cheap flush trim router bit. I've had it forever. It's old. If it gets dull, I don't really care. I probably wouldn't use a nice new router bit, but it did the job. It works super easy. And if you aren't comfortable doing anything, don't do it. You can simply hand file these down. Heck, you don't even need to add splines at all. And here's a close-up action of what's going on here. So I'm just taking tiny passes here, and all these clips are sped up, so I'm going way slower than this. You could also cut the splines a lot smaller. I just would rather have them a little oversized than undersized. But again, a hand file will do just fine, just take a little longer. So let's get started on the door. Instead of figuring out the angles and doing all that, we're just going to clamp it on here and just mark it out with white lead, and then just go over to the table saw, cut it close, and then we're just going to nibble away until it fits in the drawer slot perfect. About 37 cuts later, and we have a perfect fit. I will cut more of this off later just to allow for wood movement, but for now, this is good. So now to add the handle. I wasn't going to use the degree of the body to add the angle to it, but it just wasn't enough and it wasn't really noticeably angled, so I just simply used the base, and that seemed to work out great. For the final size of the drawer, I accounted for about a 1/16 to an 1/8 inch of a gap on the top and the bottom, and then about a 32nd to 16th on the sides. And then sand your piece. Be careful with the brass splines since they are more dense than the wood. Blow it off to remove any dust, and ready for finish. So typically I like to add a natural finish to our nicer pieces of furniture, but since this is for a customer, Jess wanted a nice durable finish on it, so we ended up going with a water-based amber ring poly, and I ended up doing 5 coats. I was shooting for 4, but on the last coat I got some drips, so I gave it a quick sanding, and 5 coats it was. So we're going to use our Suizan saw to cut the grooves for our Bloom or Blum drawer slides. This is my first time using them, and they actually went pretty well. I got a ton of crap in my prior videos for using regular drawer slides, so we got a little fancy on this one. And then I branded the drawer to leave my mark, and then just tapped it with the sander. And like always, there's a ton of different ways to do something, but for me, I just like these little figure-8 clips for nightstands and coffee tables and stuff like that. They work great. Z-clips also work great too, but for this application, I just think these work a little bit better. You can't see them, they allow for wood movement, and they're just easy to install. Always make sure your base is on there nice and even, and then it's ready to attach. And of course, to do anything, you need about 8 drills, because who wants to change bits? So since I couldn't reach in and attach the drawer from the back, I had to attach it, open it, and then lock it in place. But the double-sided tape just wasn't working. I ended up trying 2 strips, and when that fails, I just use some CA glue and some masking tape, and that stuff is insanely strong. And this is just a 1/4 inch piece of MDF. I just stained it with Jack O' Bean, and you'll never see this. I just think it closes off the piece nicely. And that is it for the video, guys. Thanks for watching. We appreciate all you. Make sure you check us out on Instagram, TikTok, wherever you can find us. Plans will be available. Just check the description. I'll have all the information there, along with all the stuff we use in this video. Hope you all have a wonderful day.